Okay, good afternoon everyone. How's everyone doing today? Good. First things first, can you hear me okay? Am I loud enough? Am I too loud? No, I got a thumbs up. Okay, I'm going for it. We've got a series of speakers for you today. But before we start, there's two groups I always like to honor. If you've been here before, you know what I'm going to say. But the first group we always like to honor are the veterans. If there's any veterans in the crowd, please stand up and let us give you a round of applause. Thank you very much for your service, especially you, Bob. Bob's ready to go to combat right now. He's got the flight suit on, he's ready. The second group we always like, and they're cheating, they're getting ahead of me, are the docents, the museum docents. If you're a docent, stand up, let us thank you. These are the folks that make the museum truly what it is. All right, thank you very much. So to introduce our first speaker, I'm going to bring up a friend of mine, and I'm sure most of you know him. I think he's behind me, yep. So please welcome Dr. Dave Thompson.
Thank you, Dickie. Okay, a word about the person that we'll be speaking about today. A Georgette, better known as Dickie Chapelle, from Sherwood, Wisconsin, and who had covered the Pacific Theater during World War II and the Korean War for National Geographic, was a war correspondent in South Vietnam for the National Observer. When on patrol with the Marines near Chu Lai, 4 November 1965, she was mortally wounded by an exploding Viet Cong mine. Dickie Chapelle was the first war correspondent to lose their life in Vietnam, and the first female war correspondent to lose their life in any conflict. And now our speaker. John Garofalo was born in Chicago, Illinois, and raised in Thousand Oaks, California. Embarked on a career in the entertainment industry, starting in the mailroom, and eventually becoming vice president at 20th Century Fox. John joined the Coast Guard Reserve in 1989 and served 2 years active duty, assigned to the then Defense Department, where he worked on the 1995 50th anniversary of World War II. Captain Garofalo remained in the Coast Guard Reserve for 30 years, during which time he was again called back to active duty and deployed to Kuwait during Operation Iraqi Freedom. John was awarded a PhD from the School of Cinematic Arts at USC, has taught at the Coast Guard Academy, and will be teaching war films and warrior culture at Yale next semester. His book, Dickie Chapelle Under Fire, was awarded the Independent Book Publishing Association's prestigious Benjamin Franklin Silver Award. Retired Captain Garofalo currently lives with his wife, Yelena, and daughter, Diana, in Oak Park, California. Welcome, if you will, John Garofalo.
This is a quote that Douglas MacArthur had wrongfully attributed to Plato. I think this is a really important quote because I think it speaks to something that's very, very profound and something that we have yet to escape in our 5,000 years of recorded history, is that we all know that wars are a terrible thing. But in spite of how horrible they are, and everyone generally agrees with that, unfortunately, we still do it. We still fight wars to this day, and so it really, I think, is one of our most unfortunate of human tragedies that we have. And Dickie was sort of in the middle of that in the course of her life. She wanted to tell the truth about war. Because the first casualty, as you may have heard, in war is the truth. Secondly, this is a great quote that I found, and this is one of those heartbreaking things that always has just been bothering me for at least 10 or 12 years, because I didn't find this quote until after the book was too far along in the publishing process for it to be added. But I thought it was a great quote. And I think it works so well in Dickie's story because You know, Dickie made tens of thousands of moral decisions. She wasn't taking pictures, she was making moral decisions. And I think this is why this is such a profound comment from Salman Rushdie. And again, I wish I saw it in time to put it in the book. But there may be a second edition, so that'll end up there at this point. But I think this hymn is very, very profound. It speaks to really what was the essence of Dickie Chapelle. If I stopped here, if that's all you know enough. Oh, I'm going backwards. Yes, I'm going backwards. So this picture was already up, and I know it's a really difficult picture to watch. This is the last photo that was ever taken of Dickie Chapelle, and this is moments after she was hit by shrapnel from an exploding booby trap that was tripped by a Marine that was walking ahead of her. 6 Marines were injured, and Dickie Chapelle, and she turned out to be the only casualty that died. And it's a dramatic picture, and there's some pathos with this as well. And it's easy to get wrapped around the fact that Dickie was the first American female war correspondent killed in action, which is a true statement. But I like to believe that what's more important is to understand her life. So here's Dickie's favorite picture taken of herself at work. And ironically, it was taken by a photographer who was at Iwo Jima. He actually was the photographer that took a photo of the first flag raising at Iwo Jima. And not everybody knows this, but there were actually 2 flag raisings. The first one, which was captured by Master Sergeant, then probably Corporal Lewis Lowry. And then they wanted to put up a second flag, which was much larger, so that it could be seen from all across the fleet and all across Iwo Jima. And so that's where the second flag raising came from, with the iconic image by Joe Rosenthal. It's a great picture, and I think to me it's still, it's one of those things that when I lived in Washington, I, always was inspired when I would go over to the Marine Memorial. I mean, it's one of those things that just always really, really makes you, both sorry, proud to be an American, and realize the sacrifice that those guys had made for us. But Dickie Chapelle, like everybody else that's had a life, started out as a child. She was born in Milwaukee, and she lived in a suburb called Shorewood, Wisconsin, which was nearby. She grew up there, and I would love to tell you all about her childhood, because it's kind of an interesting story, but unfortunately, we don't have enough time to do that. So what I'm going to do is just kind of move through this pretty quickly. There's one thing I'd like to do. Forgot to grab some of my notes. So I need a volunteer, preferably a female volunteer, to read something for me. Anybody here brave enough to do that? Or do I have to grab one of her nieces? Ah, there we go. We have a brave person here.
Okay.
Grab the stage.
1. Georgie Lou Meyer, quote, "I grew up in the heartland of the United States," unquote. "I believed I could do anything I really wanted to do and still believe it. Nowhere else in the world can a woman of 17 or an old woman in her 40s, as I am, say, I can do anything I want to do, but I'm going to condition it. You can do anything you want to do if you want to do it so badly you'll give up everything else to do it. Because it's only true if you accept the whole proposition. That's how great the freedom is for an American woman at this time."
She'll be finishing the rest of the presentation too. So this is Dickie when she was in middle school, walking to school, and she was a really bright kid. She graduated from high school at 16. She was a valedictorian at Charlotte High School, and she went to MIT, and where she actually had a scholarship to study aeronautical engineering. But She was also very patriotic to the flagpole that was on the way to school, so she would stop and salute the flag every morning at that time of her life. She's the one in the middle, by the way. So when Dickie was young, she was, you know, your average kid that lived in Wisconsin, and she had a lot of interest in things. She was interested in writing, but she saw something that this person was involved in that was really important. Anybody recognize this guy? You're all too young, so I'm going to give you a little help here. It's not her father, not a relative, not a teacher. He is a very, very famous explorer named Admiral Richard Byrd. So Admiral Byrd was a tremendous influence on her because at that time, young Dickie became completely enamored with Byrd, and she became enamored with flying and aviation and being an explorer. So she wanted to explore the world, she wanted to be an aviator, and all these kinds of things. Now her mother was much more practical and said, no, you're not going to be a pilot. I'm not going to let my daughter go out in one of those contraptions and get herself killed. You're going to study aeronautical engineering, which is what she did. So she goes to MIT. There you go. So that's young Dickie at MIT standing next to a Coast Guard seaplane. While she was at MIT, studying aeronautical engineering, she spent a lot of time hanging out at the Navy base and the Coast Guard base. And in fact, she ended up getting her first article published by writing a story about how the Coast Guard uses telemetry in order to, you know, vector planes, seaplanes, or planes to a specific location and all that. So that was her first written and published story. Now this one, Dickie's about 17 here. And so she's hanging out at a Navy base. And so when I saw this picture, I said, this has got to go in the book. Because I look at this and I kept on thinking about her dad. You know, it's like if I were her father, I probably would have dragged her. I would have dragged her out of that place. So she's hanging out with the sailors when she's sitting there with a big grin on her face. So I could see my daughter up there. Every time it's like it transposes to my daughter. It's like, yeah, there's no way that this would ever happen. But needless to say, and this is important because she was hanging out at the Coast Guard base and she was hanging out at the Navy base. She got a story written. She was writing stories about things that were interesting to her. The problem was she wasn't going to class. So after 2 years of being at MIT, they invited her to leave. So she flunked out of MIT, went back to Milwaukee. She was devastated about that. It was embarrassing and all that. But what she ended up doing was getting involved in aviation because of the fact that there was Curtiss Wright had an airfield near Milwaukee at that time. So she would go out and hang out over there. And so she would go there every day. She met all the pilots. They said that we'll give you flying lessons in exchange for doing, you know, administrative work and all that stuff. Well, that worked great until she got punched in the face by one of the pilot's girlfriends who thought that they were, you know, having an affair or something, which was completely untrue. But, you know, that was a good excuse for her mom to send her to Coral Gables, Florida to live with her grandmother. Now, that's important. Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Great. So she's down in Coral Gables living with Granny, as she called her. And so what they didn't realize is that there was a Miami Air Show. Yeah, there was a Miami Air Show, and so what did Dickie do? She went to the Miami Air Show and she met people, and so she started working for the people that ran the Miami Air Show. So what happened next? Well, there was the Havana Air Show next, which she went over and basically was doing the same thing. She was doing publicity work for the organizers and things, and so she ended up, unfortunately, being the witness of a terrible plane crash that happened there. And so she was running over to a payphone, and she basically filed a story that was published in the New York Times about this terrible accident that happened with this famous Cuban aviator. So what happened with that is that she ended up getting a job at TWA when people at TWA found out about this kid that basically did the story in the New York Times and how it all happened. So she ended up getting a job in New York working for TWA, where she meets somebody. If you can advance that for me. There we go. Where she meets this character. This character is Tony Chapelle. He was a World War I veteran, and he was the head of photography for TWA at the time. He also did photography lessons on the side, which was important because Dickie was one of his students. And I guess he was one of her favorite students because they started dating, even though she was 20 years older than she was. And it went so well that she ended up getting married to him, which was kind of a shock to her parents, who didn't know that she was married to a guy who was 41 when she was 21 or so. But actually, as it turned out, they liked Tony. They actually were thinking, it was like, thank God, now she finally has got some full-time adult supervision. So she worked with Tony, who taught her photography, and he did a good job. So basically, she started working on doing photo shoots and things like that. She was out doing a whole bunch of things, and essentially, she finally got the attention of Look. So she did actually have, I had brought a Look magazine, it's one of the photos, but she had 3 photos. You might not have seen that. She had 3 photo essays that were published in Look magazine in 1941 through 1942, when World War II broke out. Her husband, Tony, who had been in the Navy in World War I, volunteered for the Navy again. He was a chief photographer's mate. He was sent to Panama, which was restricted because it was a war zone and Dickie couldn't go. So this is actually how Dickie Chapelle became a war correspondent. It wasn't because she had a burning desire to do so, but what she realized is, well, if dependents or spouses can't go to the Navy base down in Panama, what about reporters? I'll contact Luke to see if they will basically sponsor me to get accreditation as a war correspondent to go down to Panama, which is what she did, and that's how she started as a war correspondent. None of the pictures that she took in Panama ever were published, unfortunately. She was chasing the 14th Infantry Division, who was training in Panama, and later on they would get sent to the Philippines, but it was just really nothing that came of it. Tony eventually got sent away, and she ended up back in New York, working actually in PR, but she spent a lot of time writing. Now, what was interesting is that she was a diligent writer. She wrote 2,000 words a day on her little manual typewriter. That was her minimum target. And later on, she quoted saying that basically, whenever things were really rough, she would think to herself, it's like, well, at least it's not as bad as typing 2,000 words a day. So, anyway. So what happened was that actually got her to be a war correspondent. So while it didn't work out, she ended up back in the States. Eventually, Tony had come to New York and was working at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, but he wasn't going to be there forever. So he had another assignment that came up in the Pacific. So she went back and she got reaccredited by the Army. Actually, it was the Navy, I think it was, to go to a place called Iwo Jima. She was assigned to a hospital ship. If you can go ahead and read them. This was Dickie Chapelle in 1942, before she became a war correspondent. This is a picture that Tony took of her, as far as I know of, in front of the fireplace, but this is young Dickie. Can you, one more? There you go. So that's young Dickie with her self-portrait for one of her war correspondent credentials. Next. Okay. So she was assigned to a hospital ship called the USS Samaritan that was sitting off the coast of Iwo Jima, and essentially they were handling all the casualties. Now, if you know about the Battle of Iwo Jima, it was one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. There were a huge number of casualties there among the Marines, and there were soldiers and sailors and even Coast Guard there actually, but the Marines took the brunt of it because that was their main objective was to take that assault. So all the other services that were there were supporting the Marines. And next slide. So she did see a lot of wounded that were being brought aboard the ship. They were treated by the doctors, nurses, Navy corpsmen and such. Next picture. And she ran into some pretty horrific shots. Most of these are not, I tried not to put anything that was really too terrible. Next shot, please. Next shot. This was a shot when she finally actually was able to get on shore for a very, very short time. So this is from the airfield, looking out over towards Mount Suribachi. Next. So she saw some Marine medics there. So this was a photo that was released under the caption of the dying Marine. And interestingly enough, he didn't die. But it was one of her photographs that actually was very, very widely reproduced. She said that it was the most reproduced that she had, but I'm pretty sure that some of her later photographs that were National Geographic probably got wider distribution. But yes, this was something that she did see a lot of casualties, and it actually impacted her for the rest of her life, because what she saw about war wasn't the combat part of this during this element of her career. What she saw was essentially the aftermath of war. In this particular case, the aftermath of the war on people that were essentially fighting the wars, and it didn't always look pretty. So she understood, really, she saw firsthand you know, the bravery, the sacrifice that people make in order to do that. But you also saw the compassion of doctors and nurses that were taking care of all of these people. I mean, you know, I can't imagine being a doctor and a nurse seeing literally for, you know, in this case, a month of casualties coming in, rolling in, you know, over and over and over again, you know, and having to deal with that because obviously they couldn't save everybody. Can we go back one? So this is Major General Lemuel C. Shepard, who later on would become the Commandant of the Marine Corps, but at this point he was the 6th Marine Division Commander. And so after Iwo Jima, the Samaritan went to Guam, and somewhere along the line she met up with the admiral who was in charge of Navy Public Affairs, who basically, you know, was essentially blessed her to go on to another hospital ship, the USS Relief, that was going to park itself off of Okinawa, which was later became known as the bloodiest battle of the war in the Pacific, bar none. It went on for quite a bit of time. There were tens of thousands of U.S. casualties. There were hundreds of thousands of Japanese casualties and civilians. It was pretty awful. But Shepard was willing to let her stay, and he put her with a Marine medical leave. So they didn't call people being embedded back then. That was sort of a term that came about, you know, more along the lines with, you know, our modern wars with what we do with reporters. They're embedded in the unit. But she was basically embedded with the Marine medical unit for 10 days. So she took some pictures like this. We'll move to the next one. Let's move back, sorry. Jumped ahead of myself. So Dickie had, again, seen casualties of war again, the second time. The problem was she went to Okinawa without having proper authority. In other words, she didn't have permission to go. In fact, she was expressly told by the senior public relations officer in the Pacific to not go onto Okinawa. So when he found out that she was there, they basically sent a couple of Marines to find her, and they said that they arrested her. So they took her off the island, they put her on an LST and sent her to Guam, and that was it. So they pulled her military press credentials so she could not be a war correspondent anymore. So but there's one thing I will tell you. I'm going to try and sanitize this as much as I can, but there's something that I thought was kind of interesting because in that very, very short time that she was on land in Iwo Jima, she met a couple of Marines who were willing to take her to the front as per her request. So they drive someplace and they say, well, okay, go ahead and go up there. So she climbs up this ridge line. She's standing on a ridge line, and she knows they're like wasps that were kind of buzzing around. Well, this is kind of weird, but what are wasps doing up here? She took a few pictures, went back down, and these two Marines came running after her. And they did look happy. And so when they got closer, one of them, I mean, these are some bad words, so I'll sanitize them a little bit, but one of the Marines actually yelled, "That was the goddamnest thing I wasn't going to say the bad word, I ever saw anybody do in my life. Do you realize all the artillery and half the sniper on both sides of this effing war had 10 full minutes to make up their minds about you? Didn't anyone anywhere ever pound into your little head that you do not stand up, good Christ in heaven, on a skyline, let alone stand up for 10 minutes?" But he wasn't finished yet. "And do you realize that if you'd gone and gotten yourself shot, I'd have to spend the rest of the war 10 years after that filling out effing papers?" So that was her essentially combat experience. She actually was getting shot at. Those weren't the wasps, they were bullets that were whizzing by her head, which she didn't realize until her tent mate, when she got to Guam, and said, "There's no bugs on Iwo Jima." Those were bullets. So she was in the midst of combat. She didn't even know it for the first time. All right, next. So now Dickie has a conundrum because she really, really decided that, even though she was an accidental war correspondent, it was something that she felt was something that she really wanted to do. It gave her a sense of purpose. She realized, this is it. This is what I was meant to do. But she couldn't do it. And her husband, Tony, was now out of the Navy, and he was perfectly happy with her not being a war correspondent. He wanted her to be a wife. That's kind of pretty typical what you would expect from 1945 America, right? So what ended up happening is Dickie got a job working at 17 Magazine. She was actually an early reporter there. She was like an associate editor, and she ended up doing a photo shoot for a camp that was run by the American Friends Service Committee, which are Quakers. And so what happened is that it turns out that the Quakers were doing relief work in Europe. And so one of the people that in the American Friends Service Committee said, you know, we could use a reporter to go out there and cover this stuff, or would you mind, could you do that? She goes, yeah, I'd love to. And he goes, well, the problem is you can't go alone. You have to be escorted by a man. You're married, right? And she said, well, yes, I am. So she went to talk to her husband, Tony, about this idea about them going to Europe and then covering all the relief efforts that were happening in Europe at that time, which were pretty extensive. You should imagine the Marshall Plan was in effect and all that. You know, and of course, Tony, being the supportive husband he was, said, no way in hell. You're not going to do that. There is just no way my wife is going to do this. You're done reporting on wars. Which is not a war, it's the after effects of war. But she'd eventually convince him to go. And I think it was pretty much because he realized that if he said no, she would find somebody else to go and play her husband and do it anyway. So they spent 6 years covering the relief, all the various relief efforts of the American Friends Service Committee. She ended up working for some government agencies. She worked for CARE, as an organization. Next slide, please. That's Dickie when she was in her bohemian years. They actually didn't end up traveling to India, to Iraq. We can hold on here for a minute. But India, Iraq, all sorts of places. Actually, they had an article in National Geographic about, this is in the 1950s, about the locust wars going on in Iraq. So it's one of the stories. They have two that were published with Dickie and Tony together based on some of this work that they did. But the work dried out. And so, in fact, actually, really only after a couple of years, I mean, they were already basically just working for food and, you know, and beer money or whatever. So it wasn't like it was a lucrative thing anyway. But what happened was that they really wanted to stay out there. So they basically had this truck and created this American Volunteer Information Services organization. And they drove around for several years in that truck. Now imagine, how many people here are married? I mean, I'm not a test. I'm not like, you know, I'm not a divorce lawyer looking for new work. So. But imagine, I mean, I'm married, and I love my wife dearly, but I cannot imagine basically every single day driving in that truck and then going to sleep in the back of the truck for several years at one time. So imagine, you know, how much that might be a strain on your marriage. And actually it did put a strain on the marriage, and Tony eventually really just wanted to get out, and they did eventually in 1950s come back to the United States. But they did some pretty interesting work, and there's some great photos that came about from that, you know, and rebuilding. I mean, right now we're still rebuilding the world that gets broken by wars today. So it's a never-ending problem. Next slide, please. Okay. You know, I got one of the biggest nieces here. This would be really cool. I wonder if you guys would read this for me. I noticed that.
This is something I think you wrote about her time doing all this relief work.
So about her time doing relief work. The wreckage resulting from man's inhumanity to man, whether from the time of Genghis Khan to Adolf Hitler, was the litany I wrote and the subject I photographed, and the magnitude of relief devised never matched the magnitude of the suffering caused.
Wow. It's hard doing a cold read to something you've read before. So what she ended up doing after about 1955, after she decided that she needed to divorce her husband Tony, who was a serial philanderer, probably from the early days of their marriage, but most of the time she just overlooked it. I mean, he was still doing photography classes with photo students, and Dickie being one of his former students that had a relationship with him, she sort of understood that was a good possibility that was what was going on when she wasn't around. And so she finally divorced him. They had been married for 15 years, and it was just time for her to move on. And Tony, she had a pretty tough breakup. They eventually did reconcile. They still managed to be friends for a long, long time. But for the first year or so afterwards, it was pretty tough. But what Dickie did was decide that I really want to be a war correspondent. Now there's nobody here to stop me from doing it, so I'm going to go get my military press credentials. So what did she do? She contacted Lemuel C. Shepard, who was now the Commandant of the Marine Corps, who basically allowed her to go cover Marines on Okinawa. And so she got a meeting with Shepard, went to his office in Washington. I was going to say the Pentagon, but it wasn't. It was probably at the Navy Yard, actually, but not the Navy Yard, it was at Henderson Hall, I think. But he said, sure, I'm happy to help you. And so she got reaccredited as a military war correspondent once again. Her first assignment was, and she promised that, but first you've got to do a story about my Marine. And so she went to Camp Pendleton and she followed a Marine company for around, and she took the entire process of their basic training as it was in 1955 or 56. But she ended up going to places like, well, in this particular place, she's in Beirut in Lebanon during one of the Marines' excursions in Lebanon in the 50s and 60s. She ended up going to Budapest during the Hungarian uprising. And this happened to be one of the bigger challenges in her life. Can you move one? I don't think I have a picture of that. I probably do. Yes, I do. So the Hungarian uprising, just to refresh your memory, was in 1956, and basically the Hungarians revolted against the Russian sort of overlords of Hungary. I mean, obviously, they did have their Hungarian Communist Party and Hungarian secret police and all that stuff. But at that point, the Hungarian people revolted and said, we're tired of all this. But what happened was, aside from the fight that was going on, there was a huge refugee crisis. I mean, something you hear about today all the time, right? So we have refugee crisis for a long time. So you have people that were, at that point, going to the, to wherever they could to get out of Dodge, get away from fighting. So they were crossing from Hungary into Austria. So Dickie not only went there with an assignment from Life to shoot this. Now, the reason why Life hired her to do that is because of all the years that she was in Europe doing relief work. So that actually helped her get an assignment from Life, which was a publication that she'd never been able to work for before. So it was just really, really tough. I mean, mind you, Margaret Burke White was a long-time reporter or photographer for Life. So they already had their woman photographer, but Dickie made it in for this one. But she also, at the time, had been working in a publicity job for the International Rescue Committee. And so because of those contacts, since she was going to be in Budapest anyway, they asked her to bring in, to smuggle penicillin in to give to the refugees. So she did that. So she was doing some of the border crossing stuff. She actually met a really interesting character who was also there doing the same thing, which was James Michener, the very, very famous author, happened to be doing that. He wrote a book called The Book of Andau, which was based on his time during the Hungarian uprising, what he had experienced and observed and all this. And so Dickie had an opportunity to meet with them. There wasn't really much about that, although supposedly he did name a character, or mention a Dickie Chapelle-like character in his story, but didn't mention her name, or by name. Probably because of what happened during the time she was there. She actually got arrested by the Russians while she was helping people cross the border. And so the Russians turned her over to the Hungarian secret police, who took her over to the prison that was essentially, I think it was called the Main Street Prison, but it had a local nickname called the House of Terror. It was actually not only used by the Hungarian secret police after World War II, but during World War II, it was used by the Germans, by the SS, as a prison for their undesirables and so on. So it really had a kind of a terrible history and past. So Dickie was taken to that prison because she was a reporter. At that time, the Hungarians or the Russians were shooting reporters. So that's something that kind of became a thing after World War II. Generally, during World War II even, most photographers, reporters, and things like that, they weren't just killed because they were reporters. I mean, there were people that were killed as an incident of being, where they were at the time. Ernie Pyle, the most famous reporter of World War II, was killed by a sniper during the Battle of Okinawa on a small island nearby called, Ishima. But again, it's like they didn't know it was Ernie Pyle. It was just a guy wearing camouflage and a helmet. But in this particular case, it was known that they were shooting followers. And so, of course, that was something that Tony, by this time, they had reconciled as friends, said, this is really not a very good idea. But Dickie went anyway. She took a camera with her. She actually had a spy camera. So when Tony saw the spy camera, he said, are you crazy? You can't do this. You'll get yourself killed. So she is arrested. She has a little spy camera. She's in the back of the car. She had a tape over here. Anybody home? Anyway, so she was now taken in a car in the back of a sedan with a couple of Hungarian goons sitting in the front and another Hungarian freedom fighter that she was captured with on their way to the Main Street prison. And so she knew that if she was caught with that camera, she was going to get executed as a spy. So what she did was she actually cleverly asked one of the goons for a cigarette. They gave her a cigarette. She lit the cigarette. And so what she did was take a couple of puffs, and so no, they weren't looking. They were kind of watching the scenery, I guess. And she ripped off the camera from her chest. She put it in her glove and tossed it out the window of the cigarette. Because that's what people did back in the days, right? They threw the cigarettes out the window. So, nobody thought anything was odd. But she did go to the camp. She was interrogated quite a bit. She was there for 52 days. She spent about 30 days in solitary confinement. At first, the State Department was really doing anything to get her out. Life magazine disavowed any knowledge that she was actually had anything to do with them, except for the problem is that this picture was published in Life magazine around that time that she was in prison. So, yeah. And by the way, this is just as an aside. I wanted to follow this through, but I couldn't. There were a couple of stories from the book where people, like in Vietnam, there's a Vietnamese couple that was this young couple that was married in South Vietnam. Dickie took some pictures of them. That they actually ended up their families contacted the publisher and they said, hey, that's my mom and dad. They were in Vietnam. They got married in Vietnam. That's them. And so, but they didn't want to. They were concerned about their privacy. They didn't want to be celebrities. Like, trust me, you're not going to be a celebrity. But then I got a contact from somebody on Facebook a few months ago that said that one of those guys in this picture was her uncle. But when I said, hey, this is great information, so please give me a touch. Here's how you get in touch with me and stuff, I never heard back from them. So I was really disappointed about that. I'm going to still try and pursue it, but yeah, which is interesting about how these strange little oddball stories kind of emerged that you would never expect. That was kind of the last thing I was expecting. One maybe, but not two. Anyway, so while she was in the prison camp, she was treated. Well, prison camp. She was in the prison camp. She was in the prison. She was not treated very, very well, and so basically she was interrogated quite a bit. She was starved. Basically, they were minimizing food. She was roughed around and manhandled and all sort of things. There were probably other things that happened that she would never talk about. But it was not a good time. So she did manage to finally get released. There was sort of a mock trial, which they basically convicted her of illegal border crossing, and basically her sentence was time served. They expelled her from the country, and their lives, never come back to Hungary again. I don't think she would want to go back. Circumstances. So she came back, and she did have a difficult time. Tony actually did sort of help her kind of get through that first time being back at home and everything, and processing all of the things that happened during the prison. But she still wanted to continue as a war correspondent. So we can go to the next one. So before she gets to Vietnam, she ends up going to Algeria, and she was actually asked by the Algerian rebels who were fighting a war against France in the early 1960s, late 50s, early 60s, if she would be willing to go and report on their side of the conflict. And so she said, sure, she'll do that. So she flew out to Madrid. She was smuggled in a trunk of a car from Madrid all to, she couldn't actually get across Algeria, but they got her, smuggled her across where they could finally get her across into Algeria, probably on a boat. And she followed the Algerian rebels. And one of the things that she had to witness was the execution of a villager who was basically working with the French. He was basically pointing out people for them to kill, who were the people that you will want to kill. They got captured by actually the French, and they turned him over to the Algerians because I guess he didn't want to do it anymore. But so she had to watch an execution, and I just think that's got to be really, really difficult for somebody who had essentially been through things like mock executions, where she would be taken out into a courtyard and essentially tied up and hear in Hungarian the words "ready, aim, fire," and there was a cliff. They were just trying to intimidate her. So going through something like that. But she persevered, she continued going, and she went to cover the Castros in Cuba. She was very, very disappointed about what ended up happening because she actually thought that Fidel and Raul were legitimate freedom fighters that were throwing off the former president Batista, who was sort of a U.S. puppet, who was really a dictator and treated the people of Cuba awful. But Cuba was surprised when Fidel Castro was worse than Batista. So anyway, so she did actually try to make amends with the local Cuban population and things like that. But it was in the early 60s, and she was doing other things like going to Vietnam. So she went to Vietnam 4 times. She covered the early 1960s in Vietnam. In fact, she was there with mostly Green Beret and CIA guys, because we weren't actually officially at war with Vietnam until after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August of 1964. So in those first few times, she was literally one of the few reporters American reporters that was reporting about what was going on. So she did have a story. Next, please. There you go. So these are some of the early shots. These are both in the U.S. Army. Obviously, we're flying helicopters, and you have, these are South Vietnamese. I don't know if they're Marines or South Vietnamese soldiers, but basically taking care of some wounded. Next. This was a shot that ended up published in National Geographic in 1963, actually 1962, which was essentially, if you take a look up there, you see all of these South Vietnamese Marines who were with an American guy who's doing what? He's got a gun. He was shooting a gun out the window. So what this revealed, that this was one of the first images where our advisors were shown that they were doing more than actual advising, because they were doing more than actual advising. That was just sort of, we were calling them advisors while they're fighting a war. So this photo actually won the 1963, it was the National Press Club, but it was an award photo. I can't remember which one the photos group it is, but it was an award-winning photograph. National Geographic, from their perspective, actually had pushback from the Pentagon about that picture. They didn't want National Geographic to publish it, but to their credit, they did anyway, because it was an important story for people to know. And again, it was later on in 1962, so obviously we knew that the war was escalating and not going in the direction that people liked even then. But she also was awarded the George K. Book Award from the Overseas Press Club Association, which was really a big deal. I think that award was given to her by beforehand, Mike Wallace. George Clooney just did a play. Thank you, Edward R. Murrow. Thank you for the save. So Edward R. Murrow, I believe, was the person that presented that. But again, it was an important award for her. So this was kind of like the high point of her career, because she was recognized for her work in a very meaningful way. Her autobiography had been published in 1962, so it was really, probably the high watermark for Dickie's career and stuff. But she continued going to Vietnam. Next, please. Okay, there you go. This is one of my favorite pictures that Dickie took, because remember when she realized that war is a terrible thing, that the impact on combatants is awful, the impact on civilian populations are awful, and so now you have sort of like the blending of both. You have this family in Vietnam that literally is plugging their ears because of the noise from bombing in the background and stuff. So I think it really is one of those things that you see the heartbreak that goes on with wars that happen in other countries, and people that are really having serious difficulties with daily survival. There's no food, no water, there's no medicine and things, and so in this particular case, we were obviously there when we were, while we were fighting the war, we were doing certain things to help the local population and things, but there was always a toll that was paid because of the fact that the Viet Cong knew who we were helping, and so bad things used to happen to civilian villagers that were being helped by the Americans. They didn't particularly like that, so they were literally the pawn in the middle of battle if they couldn't control one way or the other. Then there was no place for them to go. Next, please. Okay. This was one of the photographs that she took, and I think this was probably about her last trip that she was there. She went there 4 times. And this was something that was one of the things that just killed me because I missed this for the book. I couldn't get a hold of this, and I actually had the roll of film. This is one of her last rolls of film that she shot, or at least certainly the last ones from her last time that she was there. But because of the fact that she had been a prisoner, she was very, very sensitive to the way that people were treated. And here you have a suspected Viet Cong prisoner that's tied up and behind razor wire. And Joe Galloway, who was also a very, very well-regarded war correspondent, he wrote a book actually co-wrote a book called We Were Soldiers Once and Young, and it became the movie We Were Soldiers. So Joe was at the Battle of the Nha Trang Valley, which happened in November of 1965. So he was there, and so Dickie happened to be on a patrol with him before she went on to another one. So he saw her, and this is what Joe had said, is that he saw Dickie go over to a Marine Master Sergeant, and she said she saw him rip him anew. You can guess what goes on after that. That usually rip him anew, whatever it was in the newspaper. She was really upset about it. She goes, oh yeah, you're really tough. You're really tough. Here's this little guy, that you're pushing around, and you're pushing him with all the razor wire and all this stuff. It's like, and so yeah, you're really tough. So apparently, they got the message, and so they kind of, I guess they untied him or something. But yeah, it was because she had been a prisoner, and she had been through her own hell of sorts when she was in Hungarian prison. So it was something that really was bothered. But this book, I missed this. I found it after, in all my stuff that I had collected over time, after the book it was already too far in publication for them to have that picture, but this is one of the ones that got away. So it really is something that every time I see it, I wish I didn't miss this. I wish I didn't miss this one. So, we're in Vietnam, and Dickie Chapelle is 46 years old. She had been to Vietnam 4 times. She had been working for a long time, and she was still having trouble getting assignments. In fact, when she was married to Tony, she would not take a job that paid less than what Tony was able to make, because she didn't want to. She didn't want to hurt his ego. So that meant she gave up opportunities to work. Then later on, as time went on, and actually the war was already becoming somewhat unpopular, even in 1965. But by that time, she was actually cutting her rate because she wanted to get to work. So she never had a real easy time during her career. There's some moments where she had a lot of work. She had a lot of work from Reader's Digest. She had the National Geographic things come in. The National Geographic, those stories take a long, long time to do. On the first one in Vietnam, she was there for months. And then the second time, same thing. In fact, for whatever reason, on the last story that later on was finally published, she actually, they pulled her back from Vietnam and said it's time to come home. They said, we're not going to publish anything that you've got here, without really much of an explanation. They were complaining about her photo quality. And the one thing about Dickie that I think was kind of probably somewhat true, is that Dickie was not, even though she was a classically trained photographer by Tony, at this point, she was trying to capture the drama of the moment, And so sometimes, and especially when you're doing war stuff, you don't really have the time to, let me go ahead and set the shot up. You just stand there for just one, don't move. I know you're getting shot, but don't fall. You can't do that. So she was all about capturing dramatic moments. So she was less concerned about her, essentially, what was the light meter saying and things like that. And I think that's what the problem was. I mean, just reading between the lines and things, seeing some of the earlier correspondence from the editor and stuff like that, saying, hey, you got to really start focusing more, getting these photos where they're supposed to be. But anyway, but she wanted to go anyway because she felt that this was her calling. Vietnam was going to be her war, and she'd gone there 4 times. And so there's something about Dickie's personality that I like. And there's a story that she told in one of her presentations, which she talked about Newt Rockne. Do you all know who Newt Rockne is? Some of you. Newt Rockne was a famous football coach at Notre Dame. He was like one of the most favorite coaches. In fact, there's a movie that Ronald Reagan has, one for the Gipper. George Gipp played for Newt Rockne. So Rockne, apparently, there was a story about that Notre Dame was really doing terribly in the first half of the game. They were losing pretty badly. So at halftime, they go in and, and who knows what happens. After the halftime, they come out and they completely transform themselves. They go from, they snap defeat and turn it into the victory that they expected. So during the press conference, everybody was like waiting for Dickie because they wanted to find out what he said what did he say to the kids that made them, go just turn around miraculously and win the game. And so somebody asked him, one of the senior press guys, says, wave his notebook, and yes. And he said, so, Coach, why did you tell the boys during the half to make them perform so marvelously during the second half of the game? And he said, I just told them 2 words. 2 words. Oh, well, let's get ready for this. He said, well, girls. He said, that's all he said. Well, girls. And she said, and Dickie said, it's like, I used to hear this all the time with armies around the world. We usually say something like that, to motivate their male troops. And in fact, I just saw something that was about Marine boot camp that's running on Netflix now, and I think it was exactly the same thing. It was basically the 1990s, but that's it. They called, okay, ladies, get your asses up, blah, kind of thing. So Dickie said, the reason why I mentioned the story is because I really hate it. And I hate it because, it's sort of like, it's something about, it's just not right. And so it's like, what can I do for myself? What can I do in order to, to turn things around when things are going bad? And she goes, I know. So she said, sometimes if there's something I have to do that I'm not real enthusiastic about, like stepping off, especially at night, into absolute nothingness from an airplane, because the troops I'm covering are doing this, I say to myself, all right, let's not do this like a bunch of boys. They have to have a jump master, a brass band, 3 slogans, and a sergeant. It's true. You do it like a girl. Just go do it. Just do it. So that explains her spirit, and in many respects. And of course, she actually had gone to jump school when she was 40. And so she had actually jumped with troops covering combat during the time. She jumped with the 82nd Airborne when they went into the Dominican Republic. I don't think she did any jumping in her last trip, but in late 1965, after she's hanging out with Joe Galloway and in the Marines, he ended up going and covering the Army. Those guys went to fight in the Battle of the André Valley, which he later on documented in the book with the regimental commander at the time, who was later on a lieutenant general named Hal C. Moore in the book, and then later the movie We Were Soldiers. Well, Dickie knew Joe Galloway. So Dickie goes on to the next thing, which is Operation Black Ferret. And she's on patrol with the Marines, and this is on November 4th, 1965. They just move out around 8:10 in the morning, and there are a group of Marines marching. She's behind a Marine who trips a booby trap, which explodes triggers a mortar and 81 millimeter mortar and a grenade that sprays shrapnel out and hits 7 people actually. 5 Marines, a Navy corpsman, and Dickie Chapelle. And so, unfortunately, we can move to the next one, please. So now we're back to where we started. So this is the last image taken of Dickie Chapelle. This is just moments after that explosion triggers the shrapnel that hit her, it cut her carotid artery, and so she bled out in the field. There were other reporters that were there, as you might imagine. This shot was taken by a fellow reporter named Henri Hewitt, who was a very, very well-known reporter during that time. He was in Vietnam for a long time. In fact, he was half Vietnamese, half French, and so we spent a lot of time covering the war in Indochina, years. And then later on, he was killed in a helicopter crash along with 4 other reporters in 1970. So, the irony, of course, is that he has this iconic picture that really is very difficult to watch, and it also is telling us about the dangers of being a war correspondent. There were 135 reporters that were killed during the Vietnam War. And this is on all sides. So that includes some people from the North Vietnamese news agencies and things like that. But it was a dangerous job, dangerous work, and people were willing to do it. Now, the thing about Dickie Chapelle that was really fascinating to me is that she really had become very, very, well, the Marines became very fond of her. They had a lot of respect for Dickie. In fact, sometimes they would even say, when she was later in Vietnam, they would say that basically, they'd say, hey, don't give me any crap about this woman. She's had more combat than you have, type of thing. And so the Commandant of the Marine released a message on November 5th about Dickie's death, which is really, really rare. I mean, it's not something that they typically will do for civilians that are killed. But because Dickie was so well known, and she actually was friends with the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and the message was this, his all Marine message was, all U.S. Marines the world over mourn the death of Dickie Chapelle, who died of wounds received while covering combat operations by Marines in South Vietnam on November 4th, 1965. She was not only a skilled, dedicated newspaper woman, but she was an exemplary patriot whose great love for her country was an inspiration to all who knew her and worked with her. It has been said by her immediate colleagues that she died with the men she loved. It must also be said that affection, admiration, and respect was mutual. She was one of us, and we will miss her. So that was Dickie's last day. Now, what's interesting about this is that Joe Galloway, who went on afterwards, he said he was tired of reporting on the Marines, and Dickie was going to go with another batch. He went with the Army, and he ended up in the Battle of the Yaqui Valley, which, for those of you who don't know, was the largest single battle, I mean, sort of set-piece, actual troops-on-troops battle in the entire Vietnam War. So it was a pretty tough battle. So Joe covered that, and Joe actually was awarded a Bronze Star, eventually elected in the 1990s, because while he was in the middle of all this stuff, he couldn't take pictures. They basically said, you need to take this M60, that's probably an M14 actually at the time, you need to take this, because your pictures aren't going to help us right now. So he actually was engaged in combat with, a North Vietnamese force. For those of you who don't know, the battle was basically, there were a couple of regiments of armies. The battle was going for a couple of days, but the one that ended up in the movie was just focusing on one, which was the regiment of Hal Moore. But it was a terrible battle. I mean, it was just one of those awful things. But there was a regiment of Army soldiers, and there were a few thousand North Vietnamese soldiers that they were facing. So they were definitely, outnumbered in that. Typically, you would want to have a lot more bodies than you are basically going to a fixed position, but it didn't work that way. Anyway. So Joe Galloway, after the Battle of the Yaqui Valley, went to find this story, and they did things the old-fashioned way. They got it phone, and they dictated it to somebody at the other end. And then I guess it was one of the editors, and he said, "Oh, by the way, did you hear about Dickie Chapelle?" And he said, "No, what? What happened?" He said, "She was killed last week." And he said, "I was shocked." And he actually wrote this in his book. She actually is part of what we were sort of once and young. And he said that I was, so exhausted and worn out from this lengthy battle. And now I hear that my friend, who I respected, was killed. And he said it was just too much. So I just walked out of the officers' club, which is where he was making the phone call. I sat down and I cried like a baby. And it still was something that he carried with him up until he died dead a few years ago, unfortunately. But Dickie had a great career. She was a great person. She would be a fun person to be around. It's one of those things I wish I had the opportunity to hang out with her, some of these things. But you know what? She also had a lot of obstacles to overcome. Again, she wouldn't take jobs that her husband that would pay her husband, or she wouldn't. She was just taking jobs because she wanted to stay in the game, and she was getting older, all these kinds of things. And so, it was something it didn't come easy for her. She fought the fight to keep on doing what she did, which was to tell the truth about war. So, next slide. We're done. So this is where I always like to end it, which is where we start, which is, while her death was dramatic and real tragic, but you know what? She led an amazing life, and it was something that, that really she was a person that we should all admire, and somebody that I certainly do. So hopefully you learned a little bit more about Dickie Chapelle. I think that her nieces and nephew have got some things that they want to share with you as well. But thank you so much for listening and also helping with the reading.
Yeah, thanks a lot, John. Really appreciate that. As he mentioned, we have some special guests here today, some family members, nieces and nephews. We have Martha, Dewey, Rob, and Betsy. Would you guys stand, please? Thank you for being here. Also with us is fellow volunteer Bonnie Munch and her daughter Sandy and her husband. Would you guys stand, please? And they're important in this as well. So I'm going to have you folks come on up and tell us a little bit about the artifacts you brought and how Bonnie got you guys over here. Martha, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to the Palm Springs Air Museum and Dr. David Thompson for the warm welcome. And we want to thank, of course, Bonnie and her daughter Sandy, who's from Olympia, Washington, where I am living as well. So it's been a long road and a way to get here, and we're really pleased to be here. So thank you. We've got some artifacts that we'd like to invite you to take a look at. We haven't had these out for over a decade, and we hope that it'll tell us a personal story and about why a little bit more about why she became the person that she did. And we heard about the patriotic salute on the way to school. Her grandparents were from Germany. They were born in Germany and sought refuge in the United States under the protections of the Constitution. So she grew up with this tremendous feeling about the United States, and she led apparently her companions there in this salute. So what we have here are, this is chronological from left to right. This is her early life. We have life with her husband here. These, just while I'm here are books that are about her, including her, and then also her autobiography. So there's been 4 sort of long books, 3 long books about her and her autobiography. We've got, so Dickie was also, we've heard a lot about all the things that incredibly inspiring things that she did. She was also, so here's personal reflection, she wowed us as little kids. I was 12 when she passed, so she would come to our house in Madison, and she had all this New York glamour about her, and we were fascinated. She would put on her powder and her false eyelashes, and she had Saks Fifth. When she was flush, she bought, Saks Fifth Avenue. You can see how small she is by the size of this cashmere sweater, and then there's some pearls and her lipstick, teeny lipstick container. Then we've got books here, photographs, if you want to page through them. One of the things that really struck me was the amount of humanitarian aid, and John mentioned this really wonderfully, and thanks, John, for your really great talk. I think I realized I've never heard you talk about it before, and it was really inspiring. Hello. So there's some information here about the humanitarian aid and different organizations, some of whom John mentioned, the International Rescue Committee, which was started by Albert Einstein, and she worked with them for a while. Here's one of her medals from that, the hospital ship and some of her photos. And then we have here her, and my brothers and sisters will talk about specific things as well. Here we're winding up with her Leica and this box that she carried all her equipment in. You can see it's painted flat black, as are her film containers, so that they wouldn't reflect in case of the enemy. So thanks, and I will, so here's some of the humanitarian aid in one of her pictures in terms of assisting an escape from Hungary. And she assisted probably thousands of people in this process to escape from not only Hungary but other countries as well who were taken over by the Soviets. So thank you so much for your attention and for coming, and I'm going to turn this over to my sister, Dewey.
Hi, my name's Dewey. I'm the youngest of the nieces and the last of the bloodline for Dickie Chapelle. Unfortunately, we are the last relatives of hers. So we're very honored to be able to honor her name. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is I was reading some of the books that were written about her. And one of the things that she was very proud of was her paratrooping. Learning how to paratrooping with the U.S. Army 101st Airborne, who awarded her wings, and paratrooping in Vietnam with the Republic of Vietnam Airborne, right? So this is a time when we weren't actually acknowledging Vietnam. So she was jumping in with the Vietnamese into the war to see what was going on. And she was very proud of that. And she was the first reporter, the first of any gender to be allowed to jump with the Vietnamese. So she jumped with them. They gave her their wings because of her valor and her composure under fire. But in 1961, she was already 42 years old. She's hiking over 300 miles during that time, 9 jumps, 19 operations, and 13 times under fire. Now this is just her reporting and jumping into Vietnam when we're not even in the war, supposedly. So she was very proud of all of these accomplishments, especially as she pushes into her 40s. She trained very hard to be able to keep up not only with the Marines, but with the Vietnamese Marines. You'll see some of these up here. That picture there is actually her badges that are on her hat. You'll also see it on her combat uniform. She wore those proudly. She wore her pins, her jump pins proudly. You'll see one on a purse that she actually brought to the Polk Awards when she got awarded for journalism. She wore her jump pins on her purse. So that was something that she carried with her proudly. And with that, I want to again thank you all for being here and allowing us to share this with you. I'm going to turn it over to my brother to tell you some stories about how Dickie used to teach us how to jump.
That's very true. I was only 9 years old when she passed, but I remember her distinctly as a 9-year-old boy. Somebody who came to our house had this cosmopolitan flair and taught me how to play poker, taught me how to play craps. And she was very proud of her jumping, and she wanted us all to learn how to land. So we would practice. Oh, we go back to another slide. Oh, back again. There. Jumping off of that staircase. You start at the first step and you work your way up. And you can get to the top landing and you can't see the bottom. It's about 9 feet down. So the idea was to hurl yourself up the top and land and roll like you were supposed to without breaking anything. So that's it. We all practiced when we were young. Practiced parachute jump landing. And later on as an adult, I did jump off a perfectly good airplane a couple of times and practice it in real life. So anyway, that was one of the few things I really remember about her was her enthusiasm for jumping, actually. And of course, that's how I learned to play poker and craps. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Betsy Meyer, the second oldest, and just want to chat a little bit about a project that we've been working together with a nonprofit called War Toys to help treat children or assist children suffering from the trauma of war. And they have a variety of projects they're working on, but one that we worked very closely with is they are making these, China makes 99% of the plastic army men. Their idea is to give them free of charge the molds and their patterns that they create to include non-combatants in the war toys, in the army men. And so they asked us if they could use Dickie. So they have reporters, they have medics, that sort of thing. They want to include it in the Army men, so it's not just Army men. Give them a little more humanitarian perspective and shift cultural perceptions. But very, very detailed. They work so closely with us to really include her signature features, her hollow-pointed glasses, her earrings, though her hat, of course, specifically which cameras she would have had, the knife she received from a Marine at Iwo Jima. All those things are included in the little model. It took multiple back and forths, and in the end, we were all pretty pleased. Now, the little plastic Army men are going to be not quite as, they have to be quick release molds, they're going to be simpler. But to honor her, they have this, created a pewter, more detailed version. And they were going to release it November 4th, and they just let us know they were going to. I said, oh, can we have it now? Can we have it now? We could use it for this event. And so they just shipped these out a couple days ago. We created they created little labels, give some more information about it. But they are available up here. The museum purchased a number of them to support the museum also. And Jason, wherever he is, okay. He may not come over here and chat, but they are available here, and they'll be available certainly for a while in the museum. There's a handout here. Do you want to just see if anybody would like? Then it also has a QR code. You can learn more about the War Toys organization. But we were very, very pleased with what they came up with and how closely they worked with us on the details. And Jason, did you want to say, so 1 second, do you want to say anything about availability or?
Yeah, just so if you guys are interested, we're going to be selling them after the program, and coming up, see Ann and I, we'd be happy to sell them to you. And how about another round of applause for all of our speakers today. Thank you all. Thank you for coming out. Next week, we've got another program. Michael Cara is going to talk about some of the B-17s he found on his latest expedition to try to find Amelia. So you'll definitely want to see that, and thank you all for coming.